On a bone-chilling February night in 1924, the fog rolled in from Lake Michigan like a living thing, swallowing the streets of Chicago whole. Detective Marcus Kane stepped out of his Model T Ford onto the cobblestones of Warehouse District, his breath forming ghosts in the frigid air. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but swirling mist and the skeletal frames of abandoned buildings that lined the waterfront like tombstones. He was here because of a telephone call that had come into the precinct at 11:47 p.m. A woman's voice, trembling with terror, speaking words that would haunt him for the rest of his days. They're all gone, every last one of them. The warehouse, it's empty, but there's blood everywhere. Then the line went dead. Kane pulled his wool coat tighter against the wind that howled off the lake, carrying with it the scent of ice and something else, something metallic that made his stomach turn. Prohibition had turned Chicago into a battlefield, where bootleggers and federal agents played a deadly game of cat and mouse through these very streets. But this felt different. This felt wrong in a way that settled into his bones like the cold. The warehouse in question loomed before him now, its windows black and lifeless. Number 47, Pierce Street, a building that, according to city records, had been purchased 6 months ago by a company called Meridian Imports. On paper, they dealt in furniture and textiles. In reality, Kane suspected they were running one of the largest bootlegging operations on the South Side. His partner, Detective Vincent O'Malley, emerged from the fog like a specter, his Irish accent thick with concern. "Mother of God, Marcus, you feel that? Something's not right about this place." Kane nodded, though he wasn't sure O'Malley could see the gesture through the mist. They'd worked together for 3 years, ever since Kane had transferred from New York after things had gone sideways with the Torino family. O'Malley had a sixth sense about crime scenes, an ability to read the story that blood and broken glass told. If he was uneasy, there was good reason. They approached the main entrance, a heavy steel door that hung slightly ajar. Kane's flashlight beam revealed deep scratches in the metal, as if someone had clawed at it desperately. The lock had been broken from the inside. "Someone was trying to get out," O'Malley whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Kane pushed the door open with his foot, the hinges screaming in protest. The sound echoed through the cavernous space beyond, a hollow cry that seemed to go on forever. He stepped inside, O'Malley close behind, their flashlights dancing across the vast emptiness. The warehouse was enormous, easily large enough to house a dozen trucks, with a ceiling that disappeared into shadows 30 feet above. But it was completely empty. Not a crate, not a barrel, not even dust where goods should have been stored. The concrete floor had been scrubbed clean, but Kane's trained eye caught the telltale signs of hasty cleanup, faint dark stains that no amount of bleach could completely erase. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," O'Malley breathed. "Look at this." Kane followed his partner's flashlight beam to the far wall, where someone had left a message painted in what looked suspiciously like blood. "The vanishing hour has begun." The words were written in an elegant script, as if painted by an artist rather than scrawled by a madman. Below them, a clock had been painted on the wall, its hands pointing to midnight, though Kane's pocket watch showed it was barely past 1 in the morning. "What do you think it means?" O'Malley asked, his voice echoing in the emptiness. Before Kane could answer, they heard it, footsteps echoing from somewhere in the depths of the warehouse. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Both detectives drew their weapons, the metallic click of their revolvers unnaturally loud in the silence. Kane motioned for O'Malley to circle around to the left while he moved straight ahead, following the sound deeper into the building. The warehouse stretched back further than it had appeared from outside, a maze of supporting pillars and empty spaces where machinery had once stood. Kane's flashlight revealed more evidence of hasty cleanup, dark stains on the pillars, scratch marks on the walls, and here and there fragments of what looked like expensive clothing. A pearl earring glinted in his beam, lying next to a gentleman's gold cufflink. The footsteps stopped. Kane froze, straining his ears for any sound. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant wail of a ship's horn from the lake. Then, from somewhere to his right, he heard O'Malley's voice, tight with fear. "Marcus, you need to see this." Kane made his way toward his partner's voice, weaving between the pillars until he found O'Malley standing before a section of wall that looked different from the rest. The concrete here was newer, a slightly different shade of gray, and when Kane pressed his hand against it, he could feel that it was still slightly damp. "Fresh cement," O'Malley said grimly. "Someone's walled something up in here, and they did it recently." Kane examined the wall more closely. It was roughly 8 feet wide and 7 feet tall, easily large enough to conceal, well, he didn't want to think about what it might be concealing. But his years on the force had taught him that when people started building walls in the middle of the night, they usually had something permanent to hide. A sound from above made both men look up. The warehouse had a second level, a series of offices and storage rooms that overlooked the main floor. Someone was moving around up there, and they weren't trying to be quiet about it. Kane pointed to a metal staircase at the far end of the building. They moved toward it carefully, their footsteps muffled by the fog that had somehow found its way inside through broken windows high above. As they climbed, the temperature seemed to drop even further, and Kane noticed that their breath was now visible even inside the building. The second floor was a maze of small rooms and narrow corridors. The first door Kane tried was locked, but O'Malley's shoulder made quick work of it. Inside, they found what had once been an office desk, chairs, filing cabinets, but everything had been destroyed. Papers were scattered everywhere, drawers pulled out and overturned, as if someone had been searching desperately for something. Among the debris, Kane found a leather-bound appointment book. Most of the pages had been torn out, but a few entries remained. His flashlight revealed names, times, and cryptic notations. February 14th, midnight. The Rousseau Collection. All must attend. February 15th, midnight. The ceremony begins. No witnesses. February 16th, dawn. Cleanup complete. New shipment arrives. Today was February 16th. O'Malley had found something else. A photograph that had fallen behind the overturned desk. It showed a group of well-dressed men and women standing in what appeared to be this very warehouse. But when it was functioning as something other than an empty shell, behind them, Kane could make out expensive-looking crates and artwork, as if the space had been used to store valuable items. But it was the people in the photograph that made Kane's blood run cold. He recognized several faces: prominent businessmen, a city alderman, the wife of a federal judge. These weren't petty criminals or bootleggers. These were some of the most powerful people in Chicago. And according to the appointment book, they had all been here last night. The sound came again from deeper in the building. Footsteps, but this time accompanied by what sounded like someone dragging something heavy across the floor. Kane and O'Malley exchanged glances and moved deeper into the maze of offices. They found the source of the sound in what had once been the warehouse manager's office. A man sat behind the desk, his back to them, perfectly still. He was well dressed in an expensive suit, his gray hair neatly combed. For a moment, Kane thought he might be asleep. Then he noticed the blood. It had pooled beneath the chair and spread across the floor in a dark stain that was still wet. The man's throat had been cut so deeply that his head lolled at an unnatural angle. But what made Kane's skin crawl was what lay on the desk in front of the corpse, a stack of photographs, and on top of them a note written in the same elegant script they'd seen on the wall downstairs. "Detective Kane, you're earlier than expected. The game has already begun." O'Malley grabbed Kane's arm. "How does he know your name?" Kane stared at the note, his mind racing. He'd never worked a case involving Meridian imports. He'd never heard of this warehouse before tonight. Yet someone had been expecting him, had prepared this scene specifically for his arrival. He picked up the photographs with hands that weren't quite steady. The first showed the same group of people from the warehouse photo, but this one had been taken recently last night. Judging by the date stamp in the corner, they were all there, in the warehouse below, but they weren't just standing around. They were participating in what looked like some kind of ceremony. The photographs told a story that made Kane's stomach turn. The wealthy men and women were wearing strange robes and masks, gathered around what appeared to be an altar made from stacked crates. On the altar lay items that Kane recognized from police evidence rooms: jewelry, art objects, expensive artifacts. But these weren't random stolen goods. Each item had a small placard next to it, like museum displays. The final photograph showed the group raising their hands in what looked like a toast, their faces visible beneath the masks. And there, in the background, Kane could see the fresh concrete wall they'd discovered downstairs. O'Malley was examining the dead man more closely. "Marcus, look at this. This fellow's been dead for hours, but he's still warm. And his blood." He touched a finger to the pooled blood and held it up. "It's still liquid. Blood doesn't stay fresh like this in cold weather." Kane felt the temperature in the room drop another degree. The fog outside had thickened to the point where he could no longer see the lake through the office windows, and the silence had taken on an oppressive quality that made it hard to breathe. They came from below, in the main warehouse floor. Multiple voices speaking in unison, chanting something in a language Kane didn't recognize. The words seemed to echo and multiply, filling the empty space with a sound that was both ancient and terrifying. Kane moved to the window that overlooked the warehouse floor and peered down through the fog. What he saw made him question his sanity. The warehouse was no longer empty. Figures in dark robes moved in a slow circle around the fresh concrete wall, their voices rising and falling in rhythmic chanting. In the center of the circle, someone or something stood perfectly still, arms raised toward the ceiling. The figure was taller than the others, draped in robes that seemed to absorb the light from the candles that had appeared around the space. But it was impossible. Kane and O'Malley had just been down there. The warehouse had been empty, dead silent, yet now it was filled with what? Who were these people? How had they gotten inside without making a sound? O'Malley joined him at the window, and Kane heard his partner's sharp intake of breath. "Sweet Mother of God," he whispered. "Are those the same people from the photographs?" Kane looked more closely, trying to match the faces beneath the hoods to the prominent citizens from the pictures. It was hard to tell in the candlelight, but there was something wrong with the figures below. They moved too slowly, too deliberately, as if they were underwater, and their voices, the chanting, had a hollow quality that seemed to come from very far away. The ceremony reached some kind of crescendo, and the figures suddenly stopped moving. In the complete silence that followed, the tall figure in the center lowered its arms and turned to look directly up at the window where Kane and O'Malley stood. Kane couldn't see a face beneath the hood, but he felt eyes boring into him with an intensity that made his knees weak. Then the figure raised one arm and pointed directly at him. Every candle in the warehouse went out at once, plunging the space below into absolute darkness. O'Malley grabbed Kane's shoulder. "We need to get out of here, now." But when they turned toward the office door, they found it was no longer there. The wall was solid concrete, as if the door had never existed. Kane ran his hands along the surface, desperately searching for any sign of an opening. But there was nothing. They were trapped. The chanting began again, but now it was coming from all around them, from the walls, from the floor, from the very air itself. Kane could feel the words vibrating in his chest, and with each repetition the temperature dropped further. His flashlight beam swept the office, revealing that it too was changing. The scattered papers were gone. The overturned furniture had righted itself, and the dead man behind the desk was no longer there. Instead, the room looked exactly as it had in the photograph, neat, organized, as if nothing had ever happened, except for the note on the desk, which had changed. Now it read, "The vanishing hour claims those who seek what should remain hidden." Your investigation ends here. O'Malley was checking the windows, but they too had changed. Instead of showing the fog-shrouded street outside, they now looked out onto what appeared to be the same warehouse floor, but from impossible angles, as if the building had folded in on itself. Kane's training took over. He forced himself to think logically, to find a rational explanation for what they were experiencing. Gas leak causing hallucinations. Elaborate hoax designed to scare them away from something. Mass hypnosis. But even as he ran through the possibilities, he knew that none of them could explain what he was seeing. The chanting stopped again, and in the silence, Kane heard something that made his blood freeze. The sound of footsteps on the metal staircase coming up toward their level. Slow, measured steps that rang against the metal with impossible clarity. O'Malley had drawn his weapon again, though Kane wondered what good bullets would do against whatever was climbing toward them. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and began moving down the corridor, pausing at each office door. They were being hunted. Kane pressed his ear to the wall where the door had been, trying to determine how close the footsteps were getting. He could hear them clearly now, not the sound of shoes on concrete, but something else, something that clicked and scraped with each step, like claws on stone. The footsteps stopped directly outside their office. For a long moment, there was absolute silence. Then someone knocked on the wall, 3 slow, deliberate raps that seemed to echo through Kane's bones. A voice spoke from the other side, and Kane nearly dropped his flashlight when he recognized it. It was his own voice. "Detective Kane," his own voice said through the wall. "You have something that belongs to us, the photographs. Please return them, and this will all end." Kane looked down at the pictures still clutched in his hand. The images seemed to shimmer in his flashlight beam, the faces in them moving slightly, as if the people were still alive within the photographs. O'Malley whispered urgently in his ear, "Don't give them anything. Whatever this is, those pictures are evidence. They're the only proof we have that any of this happened." The knocking came again, more insistent this time. "Detective Kane, we know you're in there. Open the door." Kane stared at the solid concrete wall. There was no door to open, but his own voice seemed to expect an answer. He made a decision that would haunt him forever. "I don't have any photographs," he called out. "I don't know what you're talking about." The silence that followed was somehow worse than the chanting had been. Then his own voice spoke again, but this time it was different, colder, more amused. "Very well, detective. Then you'll join them behind the wall. The vanishing hour claims all witnesses." The office began to shake, a low rumble that seemed to come from deep underground. Cracks appeared in the concrete walls, spreading upward like spider webs. Through the fissures, Kane could see not the warehouse beyond, but endless darkness punctuated by what looked like stars or eyes watching from very far away. The desk began to slide toward one of the cracks, and Kane realized that the entire room was tilting. Whatever was happening, the building itself was coming apart around them. He grabbed O'Malley's arm and pulled him toward the window. "We're jumping," he shouted over the rumbling. O'Malley looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "That's a 20-foot drop onto concrete. Better than whatever's on the other side of that wall." Kane smashed the window with the butt of his flashlight, clearing away the glass. The fog outside had lifted slightly, and he could see the street below. It looked solid, real, more real than anything inside the warehouse had been for the past hour. Behind them, the wall cracked open completely, revealing not the corridor they'd entered from, but a vast space filled with moving shadows. And from within that darkness, Kane could hear voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all calling his name. He didn't wait to see what was coming through the crack. He grabbed the photographs, stuffed them inside his coat, and dove through the window. The impact with the cobblestone street drove the breath from his lungs and sent jolts of pain through his left shoulder. But he was alive. O'Malley landed beside him a moment later, cursing in Irish as he rolled to absorb the impact. They picked themselves up and looked back at the warehouse. It stood exactly as it had when they'd first arrived. Dark, empty, silent. The fog had cleared enough to show that all the windows were intact, including the one they'd just jumped through. Kane pulled out the photographs to make sure they were still there, still real. They were, but something had changed. The faces in the pictures were different now, older, more decayed, as if years had passed since the photos were taken. And in the final photograph, the one showing the group raising their hands in a toast, there were two additional figures, Kane and O'Malley themselves standing among the robed figures, their faces bearing expressions of absolute terror. O'Malley saw the photograph and went pale. "That's impossible. We were never down there with them. We never..." He trailed off as they both realized what the photograph implied. Somewhere, somehow, there was a version of events where they had joined the ceremony, where they had become part of whatever the vanishing hour truly was. Kane looked at his pocket watch. The hands pointed to midnight exactly, though he was certain it had been after 1 o'clock when they'd entered the warehouse. Time itself seemed to have been reset, wound backward to the moment when the mysterious ceremony had begun. A new sound reached them from across the street, the rumble of automobile engines starting up. Black sedans emerged from alleys and side streets, their headlights cutting through the fog as they converged on the warehouse district. But these weren't police cars. Kane counted at least 6 vehicles, each one expensive and well-maintained. The kind of cars driven by the wealthy elite of Chicago. As he watched, the cars pulled up to various warehouses along the street, and figures in dark coats emerged from each one. The ceremony wasn't ending, it was just beginning. The black sedans moved through the fog-shrouded streets like sharks through dark water, their headlights creating pools of pale light that revealed nothing and everything at once. Detective Kane pressed himself against the brick wall of an alley, O'Malley beside him, both men watching as the mysterious figures emerged from their vehicles and disappeared into warehouses that Kane had assumed were abandoned. "There must be 20 buildings involved in this," O'Malley whispered, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Whatever we stumbled into, it's not some small-time operation." Kane counted the vehicles again. 8 sedans, each one worth more than he made in 2 years. Packards, Cadillacs, a Rolls-Royce that probably belonged to someone whose name appeared in the society pages of the Tribune. These weren't bootleggers or gangsters. These were Chicago's elite, and they were conducting business in the middle of the night in a district that the rest of the city had forgotten. The photograph in his coat pocket seemed to burn against his chest. Every time he thought about it, about seeing his own face among those robed figures, his heart hammered against his ribs. But police training had taught him to compartmentalize, to focus on what he could observe and verify rather than what defied explanation. A movement caught his eye 3 buildings down. A figure in an expensive overcoat was directing other men as they carried something from the back of a truck into Warehouse 52. The object was covered by a tarp, but its shape was unmistakable. A coffin. O'Malley had seen it too. "Jesus, Marcus, what are they doing with that?" Before Kane could answer, more figures appeared, carrying additional coffins. 1, 2, 3. Kane lost count after 7. Each casket was ornate, expensive-looking, the kind used for wealthy families who spared no expense for their dead. But these coffins were being carried into warehouses, not cemeteries. A church bell tolled somewhere in the distance, 2 o'clock in the morning. As the sound faded, all activity on the street stopped. The figures carrying the coffins paused mid-step. The men directing them froze in place, and even the fog seemed to hang motionless in the air. Then, from every warehouse simultaneously, came the sound of chanting. It was the same language Kane had heard inside Warehouse 47, but now it was amplified by dozens of voices, the words echoing off the brick walls and mixing with the fog, until the entire district resonated with otherworldly sound. The chanting rose and fell in waves, and with each crescendo, Kane noticed something that made his blood run cold. The fog was moving in patterns, swirling in perfect spirals above each warehouse, as if responding to the voices below. "We need to get closer," Kane said, though every instinct told him to run as far from this place as possible. "If we can figure out what they're doing." "Are you out of your mind?" O'Malley hissed. "We barely escaped that last warehouse alive, and that was just one building. This is the entire bloody district." Kane understood his partner's fear, but he also understood something else. The photograph in his pocket wasn't just evidence, it was a warning. Somehow he and O'Malley were connected to whatever was happening here. They could run, but Kane had a growing certainty that the vanishing hour wouldn't let them go that easily. A sound from behind them made both men spin around. A woman stood at the mouth of the alley, silhouetted against the weak streetlight from the main road. She was dressed in an elegant evening gown despite the cold, her dark hair arranged in the fashionable bob that was popular among Chicago's sophisticated set. "Detectives," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Kane couldn't place. "You're making a terrible mistake." Kane's hand moved instinctively to his weapon, but the woman raised her hands to show she was unarmed. As she stepped closer, the streetlight illuminated her face, and Kane felt his breath catch. She was stunningly beautiful, but there was something wrong with her eyes. They were too dark, too deep, as if she was looking at him from a great distance. "Who are you?" he demanded. "My name is Vivienne Rousseau," she replied, stepping further into the alley. "And you have something that belongs to my family." The name hit Kane like a physical blow. Rousseau. He'd seen that name in the appointment book. The Rousseau collection. This woman was connected to whatever ceremony had taken place in Warehouse 4. "The photographs," O'Malley said grimly. "She wants the photographs." Vivienne smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "Very good, Detective O'Malley. Yes, I want the photographs. But more than that, I want to save your lives." Kane kept his hand near his weapon. "Save us from what?" "From becoming permanent residents of the vanishing hour," she said simply. "You see, gentlemen, you've wandered into something far older and more dangerous than a simple murder investigation. Those photographs you carry are more than evidence. They're a contract, and by taking them you've agreed to terms you don't understand." The chanting from the warehouses grew louder, and Kane noticed that the fog was beginning to thicken again, creeping down the alley toward them like searching fingers. "What is the vanishing hour?" Kane asked. Vivienne glanced toward the warehouses, then back at the detectives. "It's a collection, Detective Kane. My family has been acquisition specialists for more than 2 centuries. We locate items of extraordinary value and arrange for their transfer to collectors who appreciate their true worth." "You're talking about stolen goods," O'Malley said flatly. "I'm talking about objects that transcend ordinary concepts of ownership," Vivienne corrected. "Artifacts that carry within them pieces of history, fragments of human experience so powerful that they can affect reality itself. The vanishing hour is when these transfers take place, when items move from the mundane world into collections where they can be properly appreciated." Kane felt the pieces beginning to fit together, though the picture they formed was more disturbing than any conventional crime. "The people in the photographs, they're your clients. They're collectors, yes. Chicago's most discerning individuals, those who understand that some treasures are worth any price." Vivienne's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "They gather once each month to examine new acquisitions, to bid on items that will enhance their private collections." "And the coffins we saw?" O'Malley asked, though Kane suspected he didn't want to hear the answer. "Transportation containers," Vivienne said matter-of-factly. "Some items require special handling, objects that have absorbed too much human experience, that carry within them echoes of their previous owners. Such items can be dangerous if not properly contained." The fog had reached them now, swirling around their ankles and beginning to climb higher. Kane noticed that wherever it touched, the alley walls seemed to shimmer, as if reality itself was becoming uncertain. "The dead man in the warehouse," Kane said. "Who was he?" For the first time, Vivienne's composure cracked slightly. "William Harrington. He was disagreeable about the terms of a particular transaction. Some people fail to understand that once they've entered into business with the Rousseau family, certain commitments become permanent. Kane was beginning to understand the scope of what they'd discovered. This wasn't just smuggling or even murder. It was something far more systematic, more organized. A network of wealthy collectors who dealt in objects that somehow defied natural law, overseen by a family that had been operating for centuries. "What happens if we don't give you the photographs?" he asked. Vivienne looked sad, almost regretful. "Then you become part of the collection. Detective, the Vanishing Hour claims all witnesses who aren't meant to see. You'll be preserved, along with your knowledge, added to our inventory of human experiences." As if to emphasize her point, the chanting from the warehouses reached a new crescendo, and Kane saw something that made him question his sanity once again. The fog around the buildings was no longer just moving. It was taking shape, forming into humanoid figures that danced and writhed in the air above each warehouse. And some of those figures looked familiar. Kane pulled out his flashlight and aimed it at the fog shapes above Warehouse 47. There, clearly visible in the shifting mist, was the form of William Harrington, the man they'd found dead at the desk. But he wasn't alone. Other figures moved through the fog, men and women in period clothing from different eras, as if decades or even centuries of victims had been preserved in whatever force surrounded the warehouses. "Dear God," O'Malley breathed. "How many people have you killed?" "Killed?" Vivienne seemed genuinely surprised by the question. "Detective, we don't kill anyone. Death is such a wasteful end to human experience. We preserve, we collect, we ensure that extraordinary moments, extraordinary people, continue to exist in their most perfect form." Kane's police training warred with the evidence of his own eyes. Everything he was seeing violated the laws of physics, of reality itself. But the photographs in his pocket were real. The dead man in the warehouse had been real, and the terror he felt was certainly real. A new sound joined the chanting, the rumble of automobile engines starting up. The ceremony in the warehouses was ending, and the black sedans would soon be departing. Kane realized this might be their only chance to get answers. "Show us," he said suddenly. Both O'Malley and Vivienne stared at him. "Show you what?" Vivienne asked. "Show us how it works. If we're going to become part of your collection anyway, show us what we're walking into. I want to understand what happened to Harrington, what's happening to those people in the fog." Vivienne studied his face for a long moment. "You're hoping to find a way to escape, detective. You think that if you understand the mechanism, you can find its weakness." Kane said nothing, but she was right. Every criminal enterprise had vulnerabilities, points where the system could be disrupted. If he could understand how the Rousseau operation worked, he might be able to find a way to stop it. "Very well," Vivienne said finally. "But understand that once you see the truth, there can be no going back. Knowledge itself becomes a form of contract with the Vanishing Hour." She turned and began walking toward the warehouses, moving through the fog as if it parted specifically for her passage. Kane and O'Malley exchanged glances, then followed, their hands still resting on their weapons, though both men suspected bullets would be useless against whatever they were about to face. Vivienne led them to Warehouse 52, where they'd seen the coffins being delivered. The building's entrance was guarded by two men in expensive overcoats, but they stepped aside without a word when they saw Vivienne approaching. Up close, Kane could see that the guards' eyes had the same distant quality as Vivienne's, as if they were looking at something far beyond the immediate present. The warehouse interior was transformed from what Kane had expected. Instead of an empty industrial space, it had been converted into something resembling a high-end auction house. Rows of velvet-covered chairs faced a raised platform, where the coffins they'd seen being delivered were now arranged in a precise semicircle. But the coffins were open, and they didn't contain bodies. Each casket held objects that seemed to glow with their own internal light. In one, Kane saw a collection of jewelry that sparkled with more than mere reflected illumination. The gems seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Another contained what appeared to be paintings, but the images moved and shifted as he watched, depicting scenes that told stories he couldn't quite follow. The most disturbing coffin contained books, their pages fluttering as if turned by an invisible wind. Kane could see words appearing and disappearing on the visible pages, as if the books were writing themselves. Objects of power, Vivienne explained, noticing his fascination. Items that have absorbed so much human emotion, so much significance, that they've transcended their original nature. That necklace belonged to a woman who wore it every day for 40 years, through love affairs and heartbreak, triumphs and tragedies. It now contains all of those experiences. Kane moved closer to examine the jewelry, and he could swear he heard whispers emanating from the gems, fragments of conversations, declarations of love, cries of despair. The effect was hypnotic, drawing him forward until O'Malley grabbed his arm. "Don't touch anything," his partner warned. "Remember what happened in the last warehouse?" Vivienne smiled approvingly. "Wise advice, Detective O'Malley. Direct contact with collection items can be overwhelming for the unprepared." Around the warehouse, Kane could see the collectors from the photographs, still wearing their ceremonial robes, but with their hoods down, revealing faces he recognized from Chicago society pages. Alderman Morrison was examining a snow globe that seemed to contain an entire miniature city within its glass dome. Mrs. Whitmore, wife of the steel magnate, held a music box that played a melody Kane couldn't quite identify, but that filled him with inexplicable nostalgia. They're not just collecting objects, Kane realized. They're collecting experiences, memories. "Now you begin to understand," Vivienne said. "Each item here contains fragments of human consciousness, preserved at moments of peak intensity. Love, fear, joy, despair, all captured and concentrated into physical form. For collectors who have exhausted the pleasures of conventional wealth, these objects offer experiences that transcend normal human limitations." O'Malley was studying the books in their coffin. "What about written words? How do you preserve experiences in books?" "Those volumes contain the final thoughts of great minds," Vivienne explained. "Writers, philosophers, scientists, individuals whose mental processes were so remarkable that their very thoughts took on independent existence. The books write themselves, generating new ideas based on the thought patterns of their original owners." Kane felt sick. "You're talking about murder. You're killing people and stealing their experiences." "We prefer to think of it as preservation," Vivienne corrected. "Consider William Harrington. He was a small man with a large ego, destined to live an unremarkable life and be forgotten within a generation. But his final moments, the terror, the realization of what was happening to him, those emotions were so pure, so intense, that they've achieved a form of immortality." She gestured toward a small crystal vial displayed on a pedestal near the center of the room. Even from a distance, Kane could see something swirling within the clear liquid, like smoke given form and substance. "Harrington's last breath," Vivienne said, "captured at the precise moment of his greatest fear. It's already been purchased by a collector in Vienna who specializes in final moments. Harrington will live forever in that vial, experiencing his death over and over, each replay as intense as the original." Kane's hand moved toward his weapon, but before he could draw it, he felt a strange lethargy settling over his limbs. The air in the warehouse had become thick, almost syrupy, and moving required tremendous effort. "The atmosphere has been specially prepared," Vivienne explained. Noticing his struggle, "a mixture of chemical compounds and other influences designed to make our guests more receptive to new experiences." Around the warehouse, the other collectors had stopped their examinations and were turning to look at Kane and O'Malley. Their expressions were hungry, evaluating, like art critics studying potential acquisitions. "You brought us here to add us to the collection," O'Malley said, his voice slurred by whatever was affecting the air. "The photographs you carry contain images of our most valued clients," Vivienne replied. Such documentation cannot be allowed to exist in the outside world. But rather than simply destroying the evidence, we prefer to preserve the entire experience. The investigation, the discovery, the fear, the final realization. Two detectives, uncovering a mystery beyond their understanding, experiencing terror that transcends ordinary human limits. Kane tried to reach for the photographs in his coat, but his arms felt impossibly heavy. The collectors were moving closer now, and he could see the same distant look in all their eyes, as if they were already viewing him and O'Malley as objects rather than people. One of the collectors, a man Kane recognized as Judge Pemberton from the federal courthouse, spoke in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. What shall we preserve? The moment of discovery? The gradual realization of helplessness? Or should we capture the entire investigation sequence? I think, said another collector, we should preserve the complete experience. From the initial telephone call through the final moment of understanding, a perfect specimen of human curiosity leading to its own destruction. Kane felt consciousness beginning to slip away as whatever was in the air took stronger hold. But through the growing haze, he noticed something the collectors hadn't. O'Malley was moving his hand slowly towards something in his pocket, fighting against the drugged atmosphere with an effort that must have been enormous. His partner caught Kane's eye and mouthed the single word grenade. Kane's blood turned to ice. O'Malley had been in the war, had served in France before joining the Chicago police, and like many veterans, he'd kept certain souvenirs from his military service, souvenirs that weren't strictly legal for civilian possession. The collectors were closing in now, their hands reaching toward Kane and O'Malley with movements that seemed both eager and reverent. Vivienne was speaking about preservation techniques, about the special containers they'd prepared for storing the detectives' experiences. Kane summoned every ounce of will he possessed and managed to grab O'Malley's arm. He squeezed once, hoping his partner would understand the signal. O'Malley's eyes were glazed but still alert. He squeezed back twice, the old military signal for understood. The world seemed to slow down as O'Malley's hand emerged from his pocket, revealing a dark object the size of a small apple. The collectors were so focused on their intended prizes that they didn't notice the grenade until O'Malley had already pulled the pin. 4 seconds, O'Malley whispered. Kane used the last of his strength to grab his partner and dive toward the warehouse entrance, just as chaos erupted behind them. The explosion tore through Warehouse 52 like the wrath of God, sending a column of flame and debris high into the fog-shrouded sky above Chicago's waterfront. Detective Kane felt the shockwave lift him and O'Malley off their feet, hurling them across the cobblestone street as windows shattered in buildings for 3 blocks in every direction. Kane's ears rang as he pushed himself up from the pavement, tasting blood and smoke. Beside him, O'Malley was already moving, pulling his partner toward the cover of an overturned delivery truck, as burning fragments of the warehouse rained down around them like fallen stars. "Did we get them?" O'Malley shouted over the roar of the flames, his voice barely audible through the ringing in Kane's ears. Kane looked back at what remained of Warehouse 52. The entire structure was engulfed in fire that burned with colors he'd never seen before. Deep purples and sickly greens that seemed to writhe and dance independently of the flames themselves. But more disturbing than the unnatural fire was what was emerging from it. The fog around the burning building was taking shape again, but now the forms were more solid, more defined. Kane could see the collectors from inside the warehouse, their robes intact despite the explosion, walking calmly out of the inferno as if the flames couldn't touch them. And behind them came Vivienne Rousseau, her evening gown unmarked by soot or flame, her dark eyes fixed on the spot where Kane and O'Malley crouched behind the truck. "They're still alive," Kane said grimly. "All of them." O'Malley cursed in Irish. "How is that possible?" That was enough explosives to level half the building. Before Kane could answer, Vivienne's voice cut through the chaos, clear and unmistakably angry. "Detectives, you've destroyed items worth more than the entire annual budget of your police department. Such vandalism cannot go unpunished. Kane peered around the edge of the truck. The collectors were spreading out, moving to surround their position with the methodical precision of hunters who had cornered dangerous prey. But they weren't the only ones in the street. From the other warehouses came more figures, dozens of them, all wearing the same ceremonial robes, all moving with the same otherworldly calm. The entire district, O'Malley breathed. They're all part of it. Kane pulled out the photographs, hoping against hope that the explosion had somehow broken whatever power they held. But the images were unchanged, and when he looked at the final photograph, the one showing him and O'Malley among the robed figures, he saw that their faces had changed again. Now they looked not terrified, but resigned, as if they had accepted their fate. "We need to get out of here," Kane said. But even as he spoke, he realized escape was impossible. The collectors had formed a complete circle around their position, and more were emerging from manholes and storm drains, as if the entire underground network of the city was connected to their operation. Vivian stepped forward, still moving with that impossible grace through the chaos of the burning warehouse. "You cannot destroy what has already transcended physical form, Detective Kane. The items you've scattered were merely vessels, the experiences they contained, the preserved moments of human consciousness. Those are eternal." As if to prove her point, Kane saw the objects from the destroyed warehouse beginning to reconstitute themselves in the air above the flames. The jewelry reformed from motes of light, the books materialized page by page, and the crystal vial containing Harrington's final breath descended from the smoke like a falling star, intact and unharmed. "Impossible," O'Malley whispered. "You're thinking like a conventional criminal," Vivian said, apparently hearing him despite the distance and noise. "You assume that evidence can be destroyed, that witnesses can be silenced, that crime scenes can be obliterated, but the Rousseau family operates according to different laws, laws that predate your modern concepts of physics and mortality." Kane's mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation for what he was witnessing. Mass hypnosis, sophisticated illusions, some kind of gas that caused hallucinations, but none of these theories could account for the physical evidence. The warehouse was genuinely burning. The explosion had been real, yet somehow the people and objects inside had survived unharmed. A new sound reached them, the rumble of many engines approaching from the direction of downtown Chicago. Kane looked toward the main road and saw a convoy of black vehicles racing toward the warehouse district, their headlights cutting through the fog like searchlights. "Reinforcements?" O'Malley asked, hopefully. But Kane's heart sank as he recognized the vehicles. More expensive cars, more collectors, drawn by whatever signal the burning warehouse was sending into the night. The Rousseau operation wasn't limited to this district. It extended throughout the entire city, perhaps beyond. Vivian noticed his expression and smiled. "You're beginning to understand the scope of what you're dealing with, Detective. The Vanishing Hour isn't simply a criminal enterprise. It's a way of life, a philosophy embraced by those who recognize that ordinary existence is insufficient for extraordinary individuals." The arriving vehicles disgorged their passengers, men and women in evening wear, who moved with the same distant expressions Kane had seen on the original collectors, but these newcomers carried with them objects that made Kane's skin crawl. Ornate boxes that hummed with barely contained energy, mirrors that reflected scenes from different times and places, and instruments that looked like they belonged in a medieval torture chamber, but which gleamed with modern precision. "Collection equipment," Vivian explained, noting Kane's horrified fascination. "We've prepared extensively for this moment, Detective. Your investigation has been anticipated." Kane felt the weight of inevitability settling over him like a burial shroud. "You knew we were coming." "We know many things," Vivian replied. "The Rousseau family has been preserving extraordinary moments for more than 2 centuries. We've collected the final thoughts of philosophers, the dying words of poets, the last breaths of kings. Did you think the investigation of 2 Chicago police detectives would be beyond our foresight?" O'Malley was checking his weapon, though they both knew bullets would be useless against whatever they faced. So this was all a setup. The telephone call, the warehouse, everything. The call was genuine, Vivienne said. Poor Mrs. Kowalski truly did discover the aftermath of our business with William Harrington, but we allowed her to make that call, allowed you to respond, because we recognized the potential value of your experience. Kane felt sick. She's dead, isn't she? Mrs. Kowalski, preserved, Vivienne corrected. Her terror upon discovering Harrington's remains was quite exquisite. She's now part of a private collection in Boston, where her fear plays on endless repeat for the enjoyment of a collector who specializes in civilian witnesses to violence. The circle of collectors was tightening now, and Kane could see more clearly the equipment they carried. The mirrors showed not reflections but scenes of captivity, figures trapped within the glass, moving and gesturing desperately but making no sound. The humming boxes contained something that made the air around them shimmer with heat distortion. And the medieval-looking instrument, Kane didn't want to know what those were for. Your final moments approach. Detectives, Vivienne announced. But you should feel honored. Your investigation, your courage in the face of the impossible, your loyalty to each other. These experiences will be treasured by collectors for generations to come. Kane looked at O'Malley, seeing his own desperation reflected in his partner's eyes. They were going to die here, but worse than death, they were going to be preserved, trapped forever in their final moments of terror and helplessness. That's when Kane remembered the one piece of evidence they hadn't considered, the appointment book from Harrington's office. He'd stuffed it into his coat along with the photographs, and unlike the pictures, it contained information about the broader operation, names, dates, location. More importantly, it contained something Vivienne hadn't mentioned, a list of competitors. Kane pulled out the appointment book and began flipping through the surviving pages. The collectors paused in their advance, perhaps curious about what he was doing, perhaps sensing that he'd found something significant. There, near the back of the book, a section labeled Rival Operations. The Rousseau family weren't the only ones in the business of collecting extraordinary experiences. There were other families, other organizations, each with their own territories and specialties. And according to the notes, several of them were based in Chicago. The Torino family, Kane said loudly, reading from the book. Specialists in preserving criminal experiences. The Chen Syndicate, they collect the dying moments of their enemies. The Blackwood Society, Vivienne's composure cracked for the first time. Stop reading. But Kane continued, his voice carrying across the warehouse district. The Blackwood Society maintains a collection of supernatural encounters in the old Union Station tunnels. They've been trying to expand into the waterfront district for 6 months. The collectors had stopped advancing entirely now, and Kane could see uncertainty in their distant expressions. Around the burning warehouse, the fog was beginning to shift and change, as if other forces were becoming aware of the situation. You think you're the only ones who traffic in impossible things, Kane said, understanding flooding through him. But you're not. You're just one crime family among many, and you've been so focused on us that you've left yourselves exposed to your real enemies. O'Malley caught on immediately. That's why you needed to preserve our investigation, he said, because we know about all of them now. We're witnesses to the entire supernatural underworld of Chicago. Vivienne's mask of sophistication was crumbling, revealing something desperate underneath. You don't understand what you're doing. If the other families discover our current vulnerability. She never finished the sentence. The fog around them erupted into chaos as new figures emerged from the shadows. Competitors who had been drawn by the explosion, by the obvious signs of a major Rousseau operation in distress. Kane saw them clearly now, men in expensive suits, whose shadows moved independently of their bodies, women whose beauty was too perfect to be human, creatures that looked almost normal until you noticed their eyes had no pupils or their smiles contained too many teeth. The supernatural families of Chicago had come to investigate, And they'd found the Rousseau operation at its most exposed moment. "Run," Vivienne hissed at Kane and O'Malley. "Run now, before they realize what you represent." But Kane had a better idea. He stood up from behind the truck, holding the appointment book high above his head. "Auction," he shouted. "I have information about every family's operations, and I'm selling to the highest bidder." The effect was instantaneous. Every supernatural entity in the district turned toward him, their attention focused with laser intensity on the book he held. Kane could feel the weight of their combined regard like a physical force, but he forced himself to remain standing. "The Rousseau family's client list," he announced. "The locations of every Blackwood Society collection point. The Chen Syndicate's preservation techniques. The Torino family's infiltration of the Chicago Police Department." That last bit was a guess, but the reaction of several figures in the crowd told him he'd guessed correctly. Vivienne was backing away from Kane now, terror replacing her earlier confidence. "You have no idea what you're unleashing," she whispered. Kane smiled grimly. "I'm a Chicago cop, lady. Unleashing chaos is what we do when we can't solve a case the normal way." What followed was the supernatural equivalent of a gang war erupting in the space of heartbeats. The various families and syndicates turned on each other with a fury that made ordinary criminal violence look like a children's game. Kane grabbed O'Malley and they ran, sprinting through the chaos as reality warped and twisted around them. Behind them, Warehouse 52 exploded a second time as competing preservation technologies conflicted with each other. The fog became a battleground where creatures fought with weapons that existed in dimensions Kane couldn't name, and through it all, the sound of breaking glass as centuries of collected experiences were shattered and released back into the world. Kane and O'Malley reached their car and drove away from the warehouse district as fast as the Model T's engine would carry them. Behind them, the fog was lit by flashes of impossible colors as the supernatural families of Chicago settled their territorial disputes with methods that predated human civilization. They drove in silence until they reached the safety of downtown, where electric streetlights and normal human activity provided a buffer against the otherworldly chaos they'd left behind. Only then did Kane realize he was still clutching the appointment book and the photographs. "What do we do now?" O'Malley asked, his voice hoarse from smoke and terror. Kane looked at the evidence in his hands. The photographs still showed impossible things, but now they were just photographs again. Strange and unexplainable, but no longer actively dangerous. The appointment book was just a book, its pages filled with cryptic notes that might mean anything or nothing. "We write a report," Kane said finally. "We tell the truth, as much of it as anyone will believe. And if they don't believe us?" Kane thought about that for a long moment. "Then we go back to being regular cops, investigating regular crimes, and we try very hard to forget that there are things in this city that collect human experiences, like other people collect stamps." But even as he said it, Kane knew they would never forget. The vanishing hour had touched them, marked them as witnesses to something beyond ordinary understanding. They would spend the rest of their careers looking for signs of the supernatural families, watching for evidence that the war they'd started was still ongoing. And sometimes, late at night when the fog rolled in from Lake Michigan, they would wonder if they were being watched by collectors who specialized in the long-term preservation of knowledge that was too dangerous to be allowed to spread. The appointment book went into the police department's evidence locker, filed under miscellaneous items, case closed due to lack of evidence. The photographs were destroyed in a station house fire 3 months later, a fire that burned only the evidence room and left the rest of the building untouched. Kane and O'Malley never spoke of the vanishing hour again, not even to each other. But every February 16th, on the anniversary of their investigation, they would meet at a bar downtown and drink a toast to the cases that couldn't be solved, the crimes that couldn't be prosecuted, and the witnesses who became evidence in collections they would never understand. And if they noticed that the bartender's eyes were sometimes too dark, too distant, or that their drinks occasionally tasted of preservation fluid, they kept those observations to themselves. After all, some investigations never really end. They just become part of larger collections. Detective Kane stood before the bathroom mirror in his small apartment, watching his reflection with the same careful attention he'd once reserved for crime scenes. 5 years had passed since the vanishing hour, and he'd aged more in that time than in the previous decade. But it wasn't the gray in his hair or the lines around his eyes that concerned him. It was the way his reflection sometimes moved a fraction of a second after he did, as if it was copying his movements rather than mirroring them. Kane had learned not to mention such things. O'Malley had been transferred to a desk job after he started talking about impossibilities during routine interrogations. The department psychiatrist had recommended early retirement. Kane had been more careful. He'd kept his observations to himself, solved his cases through conventional means, and built a reputation as a solid, unimaginative detective who dealt only in provable facts. But he knew they were still out there. The families, the collectors, the ones who preserved extraordinary moments for the entertainment of customers who had exhausted ordinary pleasures. Sometimes he caught glimpses of them in peripheral vision, figures in expensive clothes, watching him from across the street, or sitting in the back of restaurants where he ate lunch. He'd become evidence himself, he realized, a witness to something that shouldn't exist, preserved not in a crystal vial or ornate box, but in his own memories, walking around as a living collection piece. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, Kane found it oddly comforting. He'd spent his entire career trying to solve mysteries, to find truth in a world full of lies and secrets. Now he was part of the mystery himself, a walking contradiction that proved the impossible was real. His reflection smiled at him in the mirror, and this time Kane was certain he hadn't been smiling first. "Good morning, detective," his reflection said. "Ready for another day of conventional police work?" Kane straightened his tie and headed for the door. After all, Chicago's supernatural families weren't the only ones who could learn to live with the impossible. Sometimes the impossible learned to live with you.